Good morning, everyone. Here's your Mormon news update for July 29th, 2025. Today we are going to talk about the Ezra Booth letters. Both Ezra Booth, a Methodist cleric from Mantua, Ohio, and the Booth letters are familiar to students of early Mormon history. Booth was the first apostate to write publicly against the new church, and most standard histories include an account of his conversion and almost immediate apostasy. He joined the church in June of 1831 after seeing Joseph Smith miraculously heal the paralyzed arm of his neighbor, Mrs. John Johnson. He left on a mission to Missouri with Joseph Smith and 26 others later that summer. Apparently, he expected to convert many people and perform miracles similar to Joseph's through the power of the priesthood to which he had been newly ordained. When neither converts nor miracles were readily forthcoming, and when he began to see frailties in Joseph Smith and other church leaders, including seeming inconsistencies in some of the prophet's teachings, he became disaffected from the church. On 6 September 1831, shortly after Booth returned to Ohio from his Missouri mission, a church conference barred him from preaching as an elder. Shortly thereafter, he shared some of his negative feelings in a letter to the Reverend Ira Eddy, a presiding elder in the Methodist Circuit of Portage County, Ohio, and sent a second letter to Edward Partridge, attempting to dissuade him from further affiliation with the Mormons. During the months of October, November, and December of 1831, Booth's initial letter to Eddy, his letter to Partridge, and an additional 8 letters to Eddy were published in a weekly newspaper, the Ohio Star of Ravenna. The letters seem to have had considerable local impact. 1 week before the 9th letter was published on 8 December, Joseph Smith received a revelation calling him and Sidney Rigdon to interrupt their labors on a new translation of the Bible, leave Hiram, Ohio, 30 miles southeast of Kirtland, and travel through northeast Ohio, preaching against the letters. That summary comes from a PDF I found that I will link in the show notes. Now let's look at a few of my favorite parts from each letter. In letter 1, he says, "If God be a God of consistency and wisdom, I now know Mormonism to be a delusion, and this knowledge is built upon the testimony of my senses. In proclaiming it, I am aware I proclaim my own misfortune, but in doing it, I remove a burden from my mind and discharge a duty as humbling to myself as it may be profitable to others." And this, my friends, is why I do what I do, because I think the truth is important. Let's see what else he had to say in letter 1. "On our arrival in the western part of the state of Missouri, the place of our destination, we discovered that prophecy and vision had failed, or rather had proved false. This fact was so notorious and the evidence so clear that no one could mistake it, so much so that Mr. Rigdon himself said that Joseph's vision was a bad thing. This was glossed over apparently to the satisfaction of most persons present, but not fully to my own." These letters present a view of early Mormonism that I was never shown. I pictured it the way pioneer stories and movies represent it, shiny and glorious and filled with revelations and the Spirit of the Lord. Reading these letters has helped me envision Joseph and his counterparts as just a bunch of dudes making shit up as they go along, often bumbling through things and hoping the next revelation makes people forget the failed prophecies of the previous one. Now let's go to my favorite parts of letter 2. "Great promises are made to such as embrace it. Signs and wonders are to attend them, such as healing the sick, the blind made to see, the lame to walk, and they are to receive an everlasting inheritance in the land of Missouri, where the Savior will make his second appearance, at which place the foundation of the temple of God and the city of Zion have recently been laid, and are soon to be built. It is also to be a city of refuge, and a safe asylum when the storms of vengeance shall pour upon the earth, and those who reject the Book of Mormon shall be swept off as with the besom of destruction. Then shall the riches of the Gentile be consecrated to the Mormonites. They shall have lands and cattle in abundance, and shall possess the gold and silver and all the treasures of their enemies." I really did not realize that the early saints believed that Jesus would likely come in their lifetime. They had also apparently been promised riches if they followed Joseph to Zion. Even though the city for Zion kept moving, Joseph must have been one hell of an orator to convince so many that he was prophesying when the prophecies continued to fail. Back to the letters. Many of them have been ordained to the high priesthood or the order of Melchizedek, and profess to be endowed with the same power as the ancient apostles were, but they have been hitherto unsuccessful in finding the lame, the halt, and the blind, who had faith sufficient to become the subjects of their miracles, and it is now concluded that this work must be postponed until they get to Missouri. Is that like today when the prophets stand up in general conference and say, if you don't receive your promised blessings in this life, you will get them in the next life? And now on to letter 3. The condition of the 10 tribes of Israel since their captivity unto the present time has excited considerable anxiety and given rise to much speculation among the learned. But after all the researches which have been made, the place of their residence has never been satisfactorily ascertained. But these visionaries have discovered their place of residence to be contiguous to the North Pole, separated from the rest of the world by impassable mountains of ice and snow. In this sequestered residence, they enjoy the society of Elijah the prophet, and John the Revelator, and perhaps the 3 immortalized Nephites. By and by the mountains of ice and snow are to give way and open a passage for the return of these tribes to the land of Palestine. Joseph Smith was trying to answer questions that so many folks in the area had, and the answers he came up with were usually really not that great. The letter goes on to say, it passes for a current fact in the Mormonite Church that there are immense treasures in the earth, especially in those places in the state of New York from whence many of the Mormonites emigrated last spring. And when they become sufficiently purified, these treasures are to be poured into the lap of their church. To use their own language, they are to be the richest people in the world. These treasures were discovered several years since by means of the dark glass, the same with which Smith says he translated the most of the Book of Mormon. Several of those persons, together with Smith, who were unsuccessfully engaged in digging and searching for these treasures, now reside in this county, and from themselves I received this information. This is just too perfect. The Mormon Church was, and still is, just a way for the top leaders to try, and now successfully, get rich. I wonder what Joseph Smith would say if he could see the coffers of the church now. Letter 4 is up next. Taking the hand of one of the elders in his own, a hand which by accident had been rendered defective, Joseph Smith said, Brother Murdoch, I command you in the name of Jesus Christ to straighten your hand. In the meanwhile, endeavoring to accomplish the work by using his own hand to open the hand of the other. The effort proved unsuccessful, but he again articulated the same commandment in a more authoritative and louder tone of voice, and while uttering with his tongue, his hands were at work. But after all the exertion of his power, both natural and supernatural, the deficient hand returned to its former position where it still remains. I have personally absolutely never seen a miracle performed by the priesthood. And in today's day, with the ability to video at a moment's notice, if the priesthood was healing people, there would be evidence of it. And now to letter 5. Where it says, a commandment was received, and elders were directed to take their journey for the promised land. They were commanded to go 2 by 2, with the exception of Rigdon, Smith, Harris, and Partridge, and it was designed that these should find an easier method of transporting themselves than to travel that distance on foot. They were careful to make suitable provision for themselves both in money and other articles, that while on their journey they might carry the appearance of gentlemen filling some important station in life. While many who were destined to travel on foot with packs on their backs were so fired with the ardor of enthusiasm that they supposed they could travel to Missouri with but little or no money. These carried the appearance and were justly entitled to the character of beggars. For when the little money they took with them was expended, they subsisted by begging until they arrived at their journey's end. And this is how it still is in the church. The top leaders get all of their expenses paid, while those in charge of local congregations have to work full-time jobs while simultaneously giving sometimes equal time to the church for no pay. And LDS missionaries are volunteers who pay for their time to serve the church for 2 years. Back to the letter. When we commenced our journey for Missouri, we expected an effectual door would be opened to proclaim the new system of faith in that region, and that those who were ordained to the gift of tongues would have an opportunity to display their supernatural talent in communicating to the Indians in their own dialect. Some who were ordained to this office absolutely knew that through this medium they should gain access to the natives, and I will venture to say I I know that their success will be similar to that of their predecessor, Oliver Cowdery, who stated that he was endowed with the same foreknowledge, but the event has proved his presumption false. For more than 2 weeks while I remained there, the disposition of the elders appeared to be averse to preaching, either to the white or the native people, and indeed, adverse circumstances prevented it. They didn't have a magical gift of tongues then, and they don't have it now. The letter goes on to say, "We expected to find a large church, which Smith said was revealed to him in a vision. Oliver had raised up there, speaking of Missouri. This large church was found to consist of 4 females." This is not so dissimilar to what the church does today with the amount of members it claims versus how many are actually active and accounted for. On to letter 6. West of the line lies the territory selected by the government of the United States for the future residence of the Indians, to which place a number of tribes have recently immigrated. The question is frequently asked, do the Indians seem disposed to receive Mormonism, or have any of them as yet embraced it? To which question I have heard some of the leaders reply, "Oh yes," when the truth is not an individual had embraced it when I left that place, nor is there any prospect they will embrace it. In one of the letters, he talks about how the reason that Joseph wanted to convert the native peoples was because he thought they were an easy target. The letter goes on to say, "They have an easy method to supply themselves with cash at any time when occasion requires. The authority of a commandment will easily untie the purse strings of those whose consciences are under their control, and they find it much easier and better suited to their dispositions to write commandments than to gain a livelihood by the sweat of the brow. And indeed, Smith has commanded himself not to labor, and by his mandate has enjoined it upon the church to support him. The bishop, when we were in Missouri, intimated that he and others were too much inclined to indolence. He replied, 'I am commanded not to labor.'" I saw a meme once that said something along the lines of, "In the early 1800s, a farm boy didn't want to work, and now I have religious trauma." And I think this paragraph highlights that pretty well. Now to letter 7. The bishop of the Mormonite church, who, by commandment, has received his station and now resides in Missouri, his business is to superintend the secular concerns of the church. He holds a deed of the land, and the members receive a writing from him signifying that they are to possess the land as their own, so long as they are obedient to Smith's commandments. I understood this to say the members had land, gave it to the church, and then were allowed to live on it as long as they did what Joseph Smith said. The letter goes on to say, "These are the men to whom the Lord has entrusted the mysteries and the keys of his kingdom, whom he has authorized to bind or loose on earth, and their decision shall be ratified in heaven. These are the men sent forth to promulgate a new revelation and to usher in a new dispensation, at whose presence the heavens are to shake, the hills to tremble, the mountains to quake, and the earth to open and swallow up their enemies. These are the leaders of the church, and the only church on earth the Lord beholds with approbation. Surely I never witnessed so much confusion and discord among the elders of any other church." I think the same could be said of the current leaders of the Mormon Church. I bet that if the average true believing member sat through just one of the board meetings with top leaders, they would be shocked at the level of discord and infighting that goes on. The Mormon Church is not so much about revelation, but functions like a male-run corporation. The letter goes on to say, "The next morning, Joseph manifested an aversion to risk his person any more upon the rough and angry current of the Missouri, and in fact, upon any other river, and he again had recourse to his usual method of freeing himself from the embarrassments of a former commandment by obtaining another in opposition to it." This is where I believe the Mormon sentiment that Satan dwells on the waters came from. Joseph received revelation to use the waters to travel and preach, but soon found out that traveling via the water was rough, so he then received a revelation that the waters were cursed, and now LDS missionaries are forbidden from swimming while on their missions. The letter goes on to say, the method by which Joseph and Co. designed to proceed home, it was discovered, would be very expensive. The Lord don't care how much money it takes to get us home, said Sidney. Not satisfied with the money they received from you, they used their best endeavors to exact money from others who had but little compared with what they had, telling them in substance, you can beg your passage on foot, but as we are to travel in the stage, we must have money. You will mind, sir, that the expense of these 3 men was $100 more than 3 of our company expended, while on our journey home, and for the sake of truth and honesty, let these men never again open their mouths to insult the common sense of mankind by contending for equality and the community of goods in society until there is a thorough alteration in their method of proceeding. Joseph and his buddies were preaching consecration while simultaneously using more money and goods than they would allow anyone else. This reminds me of when Warren Jeffs was finally caught and arrested wearing basic street clothes, and in the car with him was $54,000 in cash, numerous gift cards worth an additional $10,000, 15 cell phones, 4 portable radios, 4 laptop computers, a global positioning system device, a police scanner, several pairs of sunglasses, and 3 wigs. All things that his parishioners were being deprived of. The letter goes on to say, place yourself from under the influence of the men who have deceived you. Burst asunder the bands of delusion. Fly for your life. Fly from the habitations haunted by impostors. And having done this, you most surely will be glad and rejoice and prove to your own satisfaction, as I have done, the falsity of Joseph's prophetic declaration. If you turn against us, you will enjoy no more satisfaction in the world. This is something ex-Mormons say all the time. In essence, I was told if I left the church that my life would be a miserable failure, but in actuality, I am happier and healthier than I have ever been. On to letter 8. The right of delivering written commandments and revelations belong exclusively to Smith, and no other person can interfere, without being guilty of sacrilege. In this office he is to stand until another is appointed in his place, and no other person can be appointed in his stead, unless he falls through transgression, and in such a case he himself is authorized to appoint his successor. But how is he to be detected should he become guilty of transgression? The commandment makes provision for this. His guilt will become manifest by his inability to utter any more revelations, and should he presume to get another man's wife and commit adultery, and by the shedding of blood seek to kill her husband, if he retain the use of his tongue so as to be able to utter his jargon, he can continue, as long as he pleases, in the bed of adultery, and wrap himself with garments stained with blood, shed by his own hands, and still retain the spotless innocence of the holiest among mortals, and must be continued in the office of revelator and the head of the church. This is basically saying that Joseph claimed to be the only one who could receive revelation, and the saints were like, how would we know if you had been deceived and could no longer revelate? And Joseph's answer was that if he was deceived, he would appoint a successor, but that won't be necessary because no matter what he does, he must remain the head of the church. On to letter number 9. From Kirtland, Cowdery and Company were directed by the Spirit to Sandusky, where they contemplated opening their mission and proselyting the Indians residing in that place. But neither Cowdery nor the Spirit which directed him was able to open the way to or make any impression upon their minds. Being frustrated in this, his first attempt to convert the natives, he turned his attention and course to the Missouri, and when near the eastern line of that state, he halted for several days for the purpose of obtaining by inquiry information respecting the Indians still further west. It appears that he was fearful that his infallible guide, the Spirit, was incapable to direct him while proceeding further to the west. Consequently, he applied to men more capable of giving instruction than the Spirit, by which he was influenced. When he arrived at the western line of Missouri, he passed into the Indian Territory, where he remained but a short time before he was notified by the U.S. agent that he must either recross the line or be compelled to take up his residence in the garrison 40 miles up the Arkansas River. As there was no other alternative, the former seemed to him the most expedient, and he never possessed courage sufficient to pass the line or visit the residence of the Indians since. Thus you behold a man, called and commanded of the Lord God, to go forth unto the Lamanites and establish his church among them, but no sooner is he set down in the field of his mission and surrounded by his anticipated converts than he is driven by a comparative nothings from the field and obliged to relinquish his contemplated harvest. This sounds like the 2 temples that Russell Nelson announced that have since never been talked about again, one in China and one in Russia. Maybe the Lord was just having an off day when Russell received that particular revelation. The letter goes on to say, another method has been invented in order to remove obstacles which hitherto had proved insurmountable. The Lord's storehouse is to be furnished with goods suited to the Indian trade, and persons are to obtain license from the government to dispose of them to the Indians in their own territory. At the same time, they are to disseminate the principles of Mormonism among them. From this smuggling method of preaching to the Indians, they anticipate a favorable result. In addition to this, and to cooperate with it, it has been made known by revelation that it will be pleasing to the Lord should they form a matrimonial alliance with the natives, and by this means the elders who comply with the things so pleasing to the Lord, and for which the Lord has promised to bless those who do it abundantly, gain a residence in the Indian territory independent of the agent. It has been made known to one who has left his wife in the state of New York that he is entirely free from his wife, and he is at pleasure to take him a wife from among the Lamanites. It was easily perceived that this permission was perfectly suited to his desires. They really were obsessed with the Native Americans so much that they were using subterfuge to try and convert them and marry their women. He finishes up by saying, "It is with pleasure I close this exposition, having in part accomplished what I intended when I committed to it. The employment has been an unpleasant one to me, and from the first I should gladly have avoided it, could I have done it and maintained a conscience void of offense toward God and man. But should an individual by this exposition be extricated or prevented from falling into the delusion which has been the subject of consideration, I shall be amply compensated for the painful task which I have performed. Yours affectionately, Ezra Booth." I would highly suggest reading the full letters for yourself. The link is in the show notes. The language isn't always easy to follow and the print is old, but they were enlightening to say the least. And last up today, let's finish with this great quote that says, "The reason religious cults are often obsessed with spiritual warfare is because it forces followers into a chronic state of hyper-arousal. They convince you that you always need to be on guard and prepared to fight the enemy. When you're stuck in hyper-arousal, you lose access to critical thinking. What ends up happening is that religious claims that might seem absurd to the logical part of our brain feel like a life-threatening reality inside the body." And that's your update today, folks. I absolutely hope you have the day that you deserve.